On the 14th of October 1942, Hitler brought to a close the summer offensive by halting all operations except those on the southern sector in the Caucasus and around Stalingrad. In November 1942, the front line ran from Leningrad in the north to Rzhev, Oryol, and along the river Don to Stalingrad, and then south to the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea east of Novorossiysk. However, the Red Army was still in the field and even beginning to grow in strength, whereas the German army in the east was nearing the end of its offensive capabilities. Its losses were approaching the 2 million mark, and the survivors were battle-weary. Vehicles and equipment were in need of maintenance, while the armaments industry was only just able to replace battle losses. For both Hitler and Stalin, the Battle of Stalingrad assumed symbolic significance far in excess of its strategic importance. In purely military terms, the main German objective was to deprive the Soviets of their supply arteries of the rivers Don and Volga, and this could have been done without taking Stalingrad itself. Rather than eliminate Soviet bridgeheads on the west bank of the Volga, above and below Stalingrad, the Sixth Army was committed to a battle of attrition in the city's rubble. The Luftwaffe was so committed to the Battle of Stalingrad that the Soviets were able to build up reserves without having to contend with Luftwaffe interference. To prevent German forces exerting additional pressure on the city's defenders, the Soviets resumed activity on Sixth Army's flanks during September 1942. Throughout October, the fighting in the city rose in intensity until, by the 20th, the remaining pockets of Soviet resistance had been pushed back to within 1,000 meters of the banks of the Volga. But during that critical month, the Soviet High Command was planning a counteroffensive, codenamed Uran. It began to assume the shape of a single strategic operation along a 300-kilometer-long front involving the Stalingrad, Don, and southwestern fronts, each of which was roughly equivalent to a German army group. The southwestern front was to break through the sector of the line held by the Romanians between Serafimovic and Kletskaya and head southeast for Kalach. 3 days were allowed for this 100-kilometer advance. The Stalingrad front was to launch its attack from the Sarepta Lakes against the Romanian line and converge on Kalach, where it was to link up with the southwestern front, thus cutting off the enemy between the rivers Volga and Don. Its left flank was to attack in the direction of Kotelnikovo. The Don front was to launch simultaneous offensives from its Kletskaya bridgehead and destroy the German forces in the small bend of the Don. The Germans and their allies, strung out along the 400-kilometer-long front on the river Don, were not so much an army group as a group of armies. South of Stalingrad was the 4th Romanian Army, while way out in the steppe near Elista was the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division. In and around Stalingrad itself were the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. From the city northwards to Kursk were the 3rd Romanian, 8th Italian, 2nd Hungarian, and 2nd German armies. In reserve, behind the sector held by the 3rd Romanian Army, was the 48th Panzer Corps. Its panzer divisions were to play the key role in the defensive fighting along the Chia River. Otherwise, there were no significant German reserves and little hope of reinforcements. By November 1942, the Romanian troops on the Don were at the end of a march which had taken them across the Ukraine and Bessarabia to the Black Sea, where for 2 months they had laid siege to Odessa. During that journey, they had lost 130,000 of their comrades.
Sie waren einwandfrei überfordert.
They were clearly overtaxed by the Russian assault. As far as equipment and training were concerned, they were not in a position to resist a concentrated Russian tank attack. Moreover, behind them there were hardly any reserves, so that the collapse on these fronts could have been forecast.
General Karl Adolf Hollit, commander of Army Detachment Hollit, was also well aware of the danger.
I remember leaving the main headquarters, the Führer headquarters, with an officer and saying to him, "Now have a look at this. We are surrounded right and left by foreign soldiers, our allies. There are the Romanians, and then the Italians, and the Hungarians are beyond the Romanians. They don't all measure up to the German troops. They can't, because they haven't got the same experience. And above all, they haven't the same armament. And I am telling you, this could conceivably cause difficulties. So I don't trust these allies one little bit." And the officer said to me, "Don't let the Führer, Adolf Hitler, hear that." And then I got really cheeky and said, "If he doesn't want to hear it, then he will soon feel it."
During the first week of November, as the Germans prepared to renew their efforts to take Stalingrad, Soviet forces began to move into their forming-up positions for Operation Uran. The marshalling of this tremendous force, while the fighting for Stalingrad still raged, was in itself an incredible achievement. 1.5 million men, 13,500 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft. Ferrying men and equipment across the wide Don and Volga rivers and deploying and concealing them in the open steppe was a hazardous operation. Increased Soviet air activity during the infrequent periods of good flying weather reduced German air reconnaissance significantly. On the eve of the Soviet counteroffensive, German and Soviet forces along the 700-kilometer southern sector were roughly equal. But by stripping other formations, the Soviets were able to build up significant superiority, particularly against Germany's ill-equipped allies. Operation Uran began at 0720 on the 19th of November, when the southwestern and Don fronts broke out of their bridgeheads and struck the line weakly held by the Romanian Third Army. Initially, the Soviet rifle divisions, with their weak armored complement, were held by the Romanians. But massed Soviet armor broke through their flanks and drove out into the steppe beyond. Despite appalling weather and poor visibility, both the Stalingrad and southwestern fronts had penetrated deep into 6th Army's eastern flank and were 30 kilometers in the German rear. At 1400 hours on the 23rd of November, troops of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts linked up at Kalach. This initial encirclement trapped 270,000 German and Allied troops of the 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket, an area 57 kilometers west to east and 35 kilometers north to south. The most important task now for the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts was to strengthen the 160-kilometer-long outer encirclement of Stalingrad by building up a strong front so that German efforts to relieve Stalingrad from the west and southwest could be held off. 6th Army's first reaction on being encircled was to break out to the west. But on the 24th of November, Hitler ordered General Paulus to stay put, having been assured by Goering that the Luftwaffe could keep the 6th Army supplied from the air. On the same day, encouraged by its initial success, Soviet High Command decided to extend Operation Uran and began to plan Operation Saturn. This called for the left wing of the Voronezh front, with 60% of the entire Soviet armored forces, to launch an offensive in the direction of Rostov, with the object of cutting off Army Group A in the Caucasus and on the Don. On the 26th of November, Field Marshal von Manstein was appointed commander of a new Army Group Don, which consisted of the remnants of 6th Army, the 4th Panzer Army, and the 3rd Romanian Army. His task was to coordinate the defenses on the flanks of the 6th Army in Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was born in Berlin on the 24th of November, 1897. He was commissioned into the Prussian Foot Guards in 1906, and during the First World War served on both the eastern and western fronts. Between the wars he held several general staff appointments, and in October 1936 was promoted Major General. In July 1942, in recognition of his superb generalship, which had contributed so much to Germany's victories, Hitler promoted him Field Marshal.
He was the typical commander of the old school, who, during the First World War, commanded from far in the rear, far removed from the actual events of the fighting and from weather conditions and hardships, but who could nevertheless make the right strategic decisions. In this respect, he differed fundamentally from the more tactical troop commanders such as Model or Rommel or Guderian. But even so, with his outstanding strategic talents, he was one among very few comparable commanders-in-chief and battle arbiters of the Second World War.
Chief of the General Staff was General Zeitzler, and his deputy for operations was Lieutenant General Heusinger. For the whole of the Eastern Front, there were only 14 General Staff officers dealing with operational matters. Central to the system of command in the Prussian-German army was the concept of Auftragstaktik, or orders by directive.
Ever since I became a soldier, and that was in the summer of 1909, my experience has been that subordinate commanders in our army were trained to look after themselves, to act on their own initiative, and to make their own decisions. This has been my experience throughout my entire military life, and it was also taken to heart in the First World War, and it paid off. In particular, the point about subordinates using their initiative, which was put into practice and used in the training of the Reichswehr. Our army at that time, under Colonel General von Seeckt. The objective of every military operation is the destruction of the adversary. As this can be changed by conducting the fighting in various ways according to a particular situation, the senior commanders, that is to say the divisional commanders and above, must be let free to choose the method of fighting. They received a directive, and this was known as Auftragstaktik. Commanders of companies, battalions and regiments in general received orders which usually went into detail.
Since the beginning of the war, formation commanders often led from the front and took important decisions on the spot. They were usually found forward where the major effort was being made.
When the commander was with the troops, as was normal almost every day, the Chief of Staff had to maintain contact over the combat area, both with the divisions under Corps command and with the senior army headquarters above him. But as has already been said, if decisions were necessary because of the changing situation, the Chief of Staff also had to be able to deal with changes in the steps taken by the Corps and had to give the corresponding orders to the divisions by telephone.
Flexible command, which encouraged initiative, and a highly developed tactical communications net were in stark contrast to the rigid textbook approach of the Soviets. It was not easy to command armor flexibly when tank commanders had to rely on visual signaling to convey their orders. If von Manstein was to attempt to relieve the encircled Sixth Army, it was essential that his forces remain as close to Stalingrad as possible. And so throughout December, the Soviets exerted enormous pressure on the German and Allied forces between the rivers Don and Chir in their efforts to extend the outer ring as far to the west as possible. The Chir line was held by makeshift units composed of remnants of the 3rd Romanian Army, German infantry, ad hoc alarm units made up of rear service personnel and Luftwaffe field divisions. These divisions were created by Goering from surplus Air Force personnel. They were well equipped but lacked training and were commanded by officers with no experience of ground combat. On the 2nd of December 1942, 48th Panzer Corps ordered its infantry to form a defensive line along the Chir by constructing strong points in depth, not linear. The strong points for all-round defense were to be manned by at least a platoon. Individual soldiers were to be deployed between the strong points to prevent Soviet infiltration. Heavy weapons, which included the 88mm guns, were to be dug in and covered, and alternative positions were to be prepared for them. The Corps headquarters reminded its subordinate commanders of their responsibility to ensure that they established contact with their next highest headquarters. Units were to report in every 2 hours at least, even when all was quiet, because situation unchanged signals were also helpful to Corps headquarters to build up an overall picture of what was happening. The ensuing battle, which developed around the state collective farm, Sovkhoz 79, is a classic example of the superiority of flexible German battle tactics, which time and time again enabled small numbers of well-trained, experienced and well-commanded troops to defeat Soviet forces which outnumbered them between 4 and 8 times. At the beginning of December 1942, the headquarters of 48th Panzer Corps was at Nizhny Chir, where the Chir River runs into the Don. Since it was the nearest point to troops of the 6th Army in Stalingrad, it was a vital bridgehead for 4th Panzer Army's attempt to relieve Stalingrad. Elsewhere along the Chir, the 336th Infantry Division was holding the line from Nizhny Chir to Surovkino. At the beginning of December, 5th Tank Army began to launch a series of heavy attacks across the Chir in an attempt to drive the Germans as far away from Stalingrad as possible. On the 7th of December 1942, 11th Panzer Division with 46 tanks was moving up from Rostov. It was then ordered to halt the Soviet 1st Tank Corps, which had crossed the Chir between Oblivskaya and Surovkino on the left flank of 336th Infantry Division, and had advanced to and taken State Collective Farm number 79. After a night march, the 11th Panzer Division's commander, General Balk, using his anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank artillery, placed them south of the farm. The artillery of 336th Infantry Division was to operate on the Panzer Division's northeast flank. 15th Panzer and 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiments advanced undetected along the heights west and north of the farm, while 110th Panzer Grenadier Regiment delivered a holding attack. The panzers hit the rear of the Soviet tank formations and their supply columns just as they were about to attack the rear of 336th Infantry Division. By the end of the battle, the Soviet 1st Tank Corps had been virtually wiped out with a loss of 50 tanks. German losses were negligible. On the evening of the 11th of December, other Soviet forces broke through the Chir line at Lysynsky and Nizhny Kalinovsky, which were about 22 kilometers apart. 4th Panzer Army began its attempt to break through to Stalingrad on the 12th of December. Simultaneously, 11th Panzer Division smashed the Soviet breakthrough at Lysynsky and then marched northwest and struck the Soviet forces at Nizhny Kalinovsky and compressed the bridgehead. On the 14th, after a short lull, 11th Panzer Division slipped quietly away from its positions containing the Nizhny Kalinovsky bridgehead and moved to Nizhny Chir, where it was to force a passage over the half-frozen Don to join the left flank of 4th Panzer Army, which was approaching the river Aksai. By the 16th, 4th Panzer Army had fought its way to the Aksai, only 64 kilometers from the nearest troops of the encircled 6th Army. This offensive, launched on the 12th of December, led the Soviets to reconsider their planned major counteroffensive, called Saturn, aimed at Rostov, and to launch Little Saturn, which called for the southwestern front to swing the main axis of its attack from the south to the southeast, and so disrupt the German lines of communication concentrated in the Morozovsk area. Powerful armored forces of the southwestern front crossed the Chir at Ostrovsky and, swinging round to the southeast, headed for Morozovsk. Simultaneously, the Voronezh front swept away the 8th Italian Army on the Middle Don and sped southwards. On the 17th of December, just as 11th Panzer Division was about to cross the Don, reports came in of a Soviet breakthrough in 336th Infantry Division sector, 9 kilometers north of Nizhny Tver. Instead of joining 4th Panzer Army, 11th Panzer Division was committed to eliminating this bridgehead. But while engaged in that task, the dormant bridgehead at Nizhny Kalinovsky suddenly burst into life and presented another dire threat. And the weary division, the only mobile reserve left, set out on another 19-kilometer night march. At 0500 hours on the 19th of December, Panzer Regiment 15 of 11th Panzer Division, with 25 tanks, surprised a Soviet tank force just as it was about to move off. While 110th Panzer Grenadier Regiment blocked its advance, 15th Panzer Regiment fell in behind the Soviet tanks and in a few minutes knocked out 42 vehicles before their crews realized what was happening.
Quite simply, we always had the edge on them, since the Russian army was so very badly led. We gained the impression that no one knew what the other fellow was up to, or what he was supposed to be doing himself. They were just individual tanks milling around. So the secret was to gain as much ground as you could, just as fast as you could, so that the Russians didn't know where they were, or didn't know where our leading tank spearheads were either.
The Panzer Regiment's right flank was guarded by 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which also acted as a reserve force. From high ground, Panzer Regiment 15 spotted another Soviet column moving south and fell in behind it, forming a second echelon. In a few minutes, another 20 tanks were destroyed, making the day's total 65. The back of the Soviet attack was broken, and the shattered remnants fled in a northwesterly direction.
Our communications system also played a role in our successes. At that time, the communications system was so good among the German troops that, without saying who we were by name, we could tell from the voice who was speaking. Of course, this is all part and parcel of the value of getting to know one another. Our communications were comprehensive in scale, they functioned splendidly, and they were so good in their own way that we were able to talk to one another as if we were all sitting around one table during a battle.
Although Operations Uran and Little Saturn had failed to achieve all their objectives, the Red Army had inflicted grievous wounds on the Germans and their allies on the Eastern Front. No amount of individual heroism and self-sacrifice could now help the Germans overcome the power and growing confidence of the Red Army.
The Soviet Union is a vast country, so the Soviet army had plenty of room in which to maneuver. It could retreat for thousands of kilometers to regroup, concentrate its forces, restore the morale of the men, receive Lend-Lease aid from its allies, and return to the attack, a strategic counter-offensive. So the very size of the Soviet Union meant that in spite of great losses, in spite of the fact that a large part of European USSR had been abandoned to the German occupying forces, the Soviet High Command could concentrate its forces, bringing in units from the Far East and from Siberia, to muster them beyond the Volga and then launch the great counterattack which ended in the victory of the Soviet Union.